Our second speaker is Arazu Farasan, a PhD candidate at McMaster University. Her work focuses on port cities in the context of Franco-Ottoman relations that fostered mercantile relations. As part of her doctoral research, she examines Marseille as a Mediterranean port city where cross-cultural networks of exchange in commerce and mercantile relations give the city its distinctive Mediterranean identity. She's received the Shirk Doctoral Fellowship, Joseph Bombardier Scholarship, and her talk today is titled Bridging Divides in the Age of Global Maritime Trade, the Case of a Jewish Merchant Colony in the Port City of Marseille.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you find the paper interesting. It's just a portion of my dissertation, so I hope I'm going to be speaking clearly. Excuse me. In the year 1669, a royal edict opened Marseille city gates to foreign merchants by offering them trade, residency, and citizenship privileges. Of particular interest to this edict were reputable merchants such as Sephardi and Levantine Jews with successful commercial networks across the Great Sea. Naturalization and settlement were just two aspects of an extensive mercantilist policy devised by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Minister of Finance to Louis XIV, beginning in the second half of the 17th century. As an important Mediterranean commercial port, Colbert believed that Marseille's participation in this economic plan was crucial in expanding France's seaborne trade. Geographically, Marseille was an ideal harbor to connect France to major port cities across the Great Sea, namely in the Levant and Barbary regions under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Historically, the city was accustomed to foreign merchants frequently penetrating its port and local markets. And finally, Marseille possessed a merchant aristocracy with a vested interest in seaborne commerce, who were also in charge of administrating the city's commercial institutions, such as Marseille's Chamber of Commerce. Colbert's ambitious goal relied upon creating commercialized relations between the crown, the local aristocracy, and Marseille and foreign merchants to strengthen France's position in the Mediterranean and consequently weaken or eliminate her competitors. Historians of French history have often focused on France's Atlantic trade in the context of the absolutist state mercantilist policies. In contrast, the important commercial role Marseille and its mercantile networks played have largely been ignored or limited to a handful of works by French scholars. Recently, historians Francesca Travalato, Yonko Takeda, and Jeff Horn have attempted to acknowledge Marseille and Jews' commercial importance within their extensive studies on France and Italy. However, much work is needed to understand merchant relations and transcultural interconnectedness due to these commercial and settlement privileges. The contribution of Jewish merchants to Marseille and to a more considerable extent France's economy during the early modern era demonstrates a period of relative peace and cooperation that promoted cross-cultural and interfaith relations across the Mediterranean. This paper is a partial representation of my dissertation chapter, which explores how Jewish merchants utilized the Crown's privileges and liberties of trade to establish a small colony in the heart of Marseille and expand their commercial businesses. By the end of the century, Marseille possessed a prosperous community of Jewish merchants who acted as intermediaries, go-betweens, and manufacturers of goods through their networks, often based on family, kin, and broader Jewish communities across other Mediterranean ports. Marseille has always been a socially and culturally diverse space as a port city, and Jews had a long history of settlement and trade in the city before the 17th century. The city's establishment began as a trading post by Greek sea surfers and merchants in 600 BC. Romans, Visigoths, Merovingians, and the Counts of Provence ruled the city until the French crown occupied this important Mediterranean port in 1481. While some sources suggest Jewish people's arrival in Marseille with the Romans, archaeological evidence traces the existence of a community to around the 4th century AD in several southern port cities, including Burgundy and Provence, where they migrated to barter and trade. By the Middle Ages, we know that Jewish households made up around 10% of the city's population and approximately 2,000 households out of 20,000. Many were small merchants, but a few wealthy families, such as the Fédération, Bondevin, and Passepère, are well known through surviving notary accounts and court documents. While Marseille Jews habitually congregated in certain parts of the town closer to their local synagogues, the city authorities did not restrict their residency. Many small vendors were involved in textile production and traded in oils, alfalfa ropes, dry fruits, rice, and cattle. Some established networks as winemakers, couturiers, corralers, and worked as intermediaries between Marseillais merchants and Jews in Spain and Portugal. A vibrant community of physicians served both the Jewish and Christian population of the city. Towards the end of the 15th century, Marseillais Jews, like many in Western Europe, found their fate as a threat to their protected status as citizens. With France's occupation of Marseille in 1481 and Jews' expulsion from Western Europe in 1492, they were eventually forced to leave Provence in 1501 and migrated in majority to North Africa and Sardinia. Despite the city's continuous migration patterns due to its port activity, Marseille inhabitants have often eyed with suspicion the town's non-Catholics such as Jews, Muslims, and even Armenian Apostolic Christians. Thus, when several Jewish merchants and their families arrived at Marseille's harbor as part of the Edict of 1669 privileges, the merchant aristocracy, who had a vested interest in the city's administration and commerce, were reluctant to welcome them. Among the families were successful merchants such as Zachary de Georges, de Nazar, Franco de Almeida, Joseph de Villarreal, and his brother-in-law, Ibrahim Atias. The latter owned trading houses in Livorno and several port cities in the Ottoman Empire. The Crown of Colbert, at least initially, dismissed the merchant aristocracy's reluctance to accept foreign merchants occupying their city. The king ordered the authorities in Provence to, quote, let Jews safely and freely pass through all the places of their power and jurisdiction without suffering, and that they, meaning Jews, be given any impediment both in coming and returning, and that they were not harassed or disturbed, end quote. It must be noted that other than by permission to conduct short-term trade, Jews had not been allowed to take up residency in Marseille since 1501. In 1665, when Colbert assumed the position of the Controller General, he had an unwavering determination to improve France's Mediterranean commerce through foreign trade. He wrote, quote, commerce was the most appropriate way to reconcile with different nations and to maintain good and mutual correspondence, end quote. In 1666, an urbanization project was put in place in Marseille to create a new neighborhood for the naval and other royal personnel. And the job was to protect the galleys that left for the Mediterranean, to facilitate the circulation of people and goods through wider boulevards, to improve port facilities, and to attract prominent and experienced merchants to conduct business. To ensure safe commercial conduct, the merchants could store, distribute goods in the newly built or improved shipyards and warehouses after the Bureau of Health inspected the shipments. The Crown appointed 16 most capable and experienced Marseillais merchants to inspect, quarantine, disinfect, and release goods and cargo if deemed safe. In exchange for trade privileges and protection, merchants had to abide by a revised, merchant code of conduct. The Chamber and its council had the responsibility to ensure merchants, local and foreign, who traded under the banner of French crown and protection, followed these rules at home and in the Ottoman trading posts, where France had trading privileges through capitulations since 1535. In 1669, the Royal Edict of 1669 encouraged foreign merchants to enter the city without fear. Quote, we are pleased that the foreigners and other persons of all nations and qualities can enter the city with their vessels and cargo, and load and unload, to stay there, to shop, to store, and to leave by sea freely whenever they wished, without being required to pay no entry fee there by sea. Duty-free entry applied to goods brought from the regions of the Levant, Barbary, and Persian territories with a promise of protection in the sea, even in periods of war. The edict also extended the possibility of naturalized citizenship to Jewish merchants, ensuring that they would not be harassed or abused by French trade policies and they could trade freely. The settlement rights were based on marriage or property purchase or conducting commerce. For instance, Jewish merchants could to become naturalized citizens by taking part in Marseille's commerce or by marrying a Marseillais woman or acquiring property for 10,000 livres, residing there for 3 years, or buying a house worth 5 to 10,000 livres and residing there for 5 years. Through these privileges, they were supposed to be naturalized French citizens, reputed bourgeois of the city, and were to be made participants of all rights, privileges, and exemptions. Notary records estimate that just between 1675 and 1680, approximately 30 families settled in the city. In southern France combined, between 2,500 to 3,000 Jews resided in this period. Despite poorly kept archival records of Jewish life, there is some evidence that Jews conveniently settled in Saint Jean neighborhood near the city's business district. Sephardi Jews made the most significant percentages, but Levantine Jews also frequented the port for business. Sephardi merchants like Joseph V. Villarreal and Ibrahim Atias, who had a successful commercial firm, found Marseille's port an ideal space to expand their existing connections in various Levantine and Barbary ports under the protection of the French crown. They arrived at Marseille's port from Livorno in 1670 with the crown's permission. An entry from June 26, 1670, show how quickly they established their homes and began their business affairs. A few days after Villarreal's arrival, his firm sent shipments between Algiers and Livorno for Mouazi Isaac Noss and Gabriel de Ferro's account in exchange for a commission. The goods involved were silk transported by their Lavernais contact, Captain Marc Allegre. Eventually, there were enough families to form a Jewish colony within the city walls with a synagogue, the schools, textile trading firms, coffee houses, and print shops. The Jewish merchant families kept close contact with familial and business relations in Marseille and across the Mediterranean. Several members of the Almeida family, for example, Shlomo de Almeida, Jacob de Almeida, Salomon de Almeida, and Antoine Mendes de Almeida, appear on Marseille's notarial records along with Ibrahim de Almeida Nunes, who was related to Emmanuel Nunes Pena, and Samuel Nunes as extended families in Marseille and in Livorno. Villarreal's firm alone conducted business in over 30 cities around the coast of Barbary, the Levant, the Greek islands, the Spanish peninsula, and Italian cities. For instance, a Venetian merchant, Aaron Volterra, was a regular associate of Villarreal's firm, making several trips between 1678 and 1679. On July 1674, another Venetian ship traveled between Tripoli, Venice, and Livorno. On February 17, 1673, Villarreal's company hired a galley named La Gare, belonging to a Venetian by the name of Bartolome Toni, who transported goods between Venice, Alexandria, and several ports in Egypt for the account of de Almeida and Jacob Franco de Almeida. Between June 1670 and December 1679, one notarial registry showed that Villarreal's company handled over 861 loads on ship belonging mostly to Marseille and Italian captains. The firm took commercial insurance on these ships for a total of 856,400 livres and paid 53,812 on premiums. Villarreal and his company exported French-manufactured textile to other port cities, brought foreign goods like raw silk from Levant and from Livorno. They imported spices, leather, woolen goods, and cotton fabrics. Their business was efficient because their vast networks and associations with numerous successful trading houses in Livorno and several cities in the Levant and Barbary, namely with the families of Ergos, Nasi, Roque, Enrique, Morris, Taman, Alambrosio, and Modena, just to name a few families. We also find the Marseillais and Jewish merchants frequently collaborated in commercial ventures in the Ottoman Empire, where many Sephardi Jews and French subjects had residency rights. The most active trading posts were Aleppo, Salonika, Smyrna, Istanbul, Cairo, and Alexandria. On the Barbary Coast, Tripoli, Algiers, but most importantly Tunis were major trading centers. Alexandria, for example, was one of the main ports in the Levant in the 17th century. By the mid-18th century, between 6.3 to 17% of all goods that came to Marseille from the Ottoman Empire passed through the ports of Alexandria. Several wealthy merchants of Marseille were active in Alexandria, and their main associates were usually Jewish merchants, mostly as intermediaries. For instance, Louis Remoza of Marseille collaborated with Jewish families who traded between Livorno and Alexandria, namely the Nals, Ergas, Silvera, Pugnaro, and Albuquerque families. Livorno Jews had a privileged position in Alexandria because they enjoyed protection from both the French consuls through the capitulation agreements and by the Duke of Tuscany through the Charter of Lavernina while trading or residing in the Ottoman territories. The Council reports notarial records and shipping disputes filed at Marseille's Chamber of Commerce as part of the Freeport Trade Administration speak to the complexity of the relationships and the manner within which merchants took advantage of trade privileges to expand their mercantile networks. In Alexandria, for example, Sephardi Jews took advantage of the lower custom fee of 5% offered to French merchants. As a policy, this reduced custom fee did not extend to Sephardi merchants. Foreign merchants could benefit from this. The way that foreign merchants could benefit from this was to circumvent the regulations by collaborating with the Marseillais merchants and trading under their name. On August 4th, 1688, for example, a royal order is found informing Marseille that the privilege which have been, and this is a quote from a document, the privileges which have been granted to the king's subjects to traffic in Egypt and the diminution of the custom duties on the goods which they carry have not been working appropriately, since some of the established Frenchmen allowed foreign merchants to enjoy the same liberties when they let them trade under their names. End quote. In one such case, Jewish merchants Ibrahim and Isaac Nav, Muazi and Jacob Franco Albuquerque, Emmanuel Argas, and Jacob and Joseph Pignaro petitioned to release their goods from Marseille's infirmaries because they were accused of using a Marseillais resident's name, Remoza, whom I mentioned before. Two other merchants, Benevito and Raffaelli from Alexandria, were involved in sending the goods which arrived at the address of Remoza in Marseille under his name, which belonged to the above Jewish merchants. The Entente of Commerce ordered the confiscation of the goods and stated that the shipment was sent under pretenses so that Remoza could sell the goods for the Jewish merchants. But the Jewish merchant claimed that the shipment was meant for Livorno and was diverted to Marseille by bad fortune. Namely, they talk about storms in the sea or that they had to land somewhere. By August, it became clear that Remoza had several connections with Lebanese merchants and was a liaison between Marseille and the Levant to sell Lebanese and Levantine merchandise on behalf of his contacts. Remoza had corresponded earlier with both Benevito and Raffaelli in Alexandria when the latter asked for assurance that the shipment would be handled accordingly by Remoza's contacts in Livorno. Examples such as these are found in numerous litigations. They demonstrate that the plan and organization of the Freeport and its administration in the Levant and Barbary, at least on paper, seemed straightforward. Merchants, nevertheless, did not follow policies accordingly and regularly. In Marseille, the authorities in charge of commerce had a better handle on how merchants conducted themselves. However, administrating the Freeport policies in the trading posts of the Ottomans left the local municipalities helpless, as merchants used informal means to conduct trade with foreigners for their profit, which did not concern the treasury of the state. The commercial achievement of the Jewish merchants seemed alarming to Marseille's Chamber of Commerce. The merchant aristocracy feared that foreigners, especially Jews and Armenians, would become competition and even a threat to the success of the local merchants. In one report, the council complained of foreigners bringing previously stored silk and other merchandise from Genoa or Livorno without paying proper taxes. Another letter shows concern over the poor quality of raw silk exchanged by the Jewish and Armenian merchants, which supposedly ruined the manufacturing business for the local producers. During an assembly of the Bureau of Deputies of Commerce, the first deputy, Guillaume de Saint-Jean, expressed his concern about the Crown's new policies. Quote, I have received complaints from various merchants that in the city lives a great number of Jews, which is against the edict and ordinances, even according to the judgment of Marseille's council, which forbids them to reside in the city. Jews must only negotiate through the commissioner and must bear the mark of the Jews. End quote. He claimed that Jews arrived in the city by the King's Council, but without the knowledge and authorization of the aldermen and deputies of Marseille. Of course, this was not true. However, in none of these documents, one would find a specific reference or proof of misconduct on the part of the Jews. We know that, on the contrary, many Marseillais local merchants were willing to take advantage of Jews' mercantile connections. A court document drawn by Villarreal's firm states that several merchants who were inhabitants of Marseille owned this firm approximately 51,599 livres. Wealthy French merchants such as François Martin, Jean-Baptiste Blanc, and Pierre Dauphin, and others suggest Jews' business associations with the local merchants. By the last decade of the 17th century, circumstances began to change for the Jewish merchants. While in 1671 Colbert wrote to Marseille's intendant and requested that he protects the foreign merchants in the city, by 1682 the state broke its policies of safe conduct. Pressured by the chamber members, the crown expelled some Jewish merchants and their families from the city, including Villarreal and Atias. Several reasons could have contributed to Crown's decision, including the constant pushback from the Chamber of Commerce to protect the interests of the Marseillais merchant aristocracy. Furthermore, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes affected not only Protestants, but also other non-Catholics. The Crown took several measures to stop Jews, Armenians, and Muslims from conducting commerce and settling in France. These restrictions were effective initially, but they failed to prevent Jews from returning to Marseille in the long term. By the beginning of the 18th century, again a series of migrations began, despite opposition from the Chamber of Commerce. In conclusion, the case of Marseille's Jewish merchant colony helps us understand how they formed a closely knitted community by using commercial liberties and privileges offered by the French state. Blinded by their self-interest, the merchant aristocracy refused to acknowledge that the success of the Jewish firm benefited their economy as well. However, one cannot ignore that this was a period of flourishing commerce for the Jews and Marseillais merchants. Despite many efforts of the Chamber of Commerce, Marseillais merchants continued lending their names to Jewish merchants when it was personally advantageous to them. Today, there is very little physical evidence of the 17th century Jewish settlement. However, notary records help us understand how they used periods of relevant peace and somewhat religious tolerance to bridge the divide between faith and culture through collaboration and association in Marseille and across the Great Mediterranean Sea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arazu, for that enlightening presentation.